Okay, in this video, I'll be teaching the second subtopic of stress, which is measuring stress. So how do we know someone's level of stress? So if we want to compare between two people, so to see which one of them is more stressed out than the other, there has to be a way to measure this. So this topic will look into that. Now, there are two main ways. One is physiological, second is psychological. Now, physiological is basically looking at physical characteristics, for example, blood pressure, level of hormones in the body. I'll talk more about that later. Now, psychological is basically one way to measure it is using self-report, questionnaire, things like that. Okay, now talking about physiological. Now, let's recap back on signs of stress. So basically, when you're stressed, the body releases hormones. So basically, if you want to know someone's level of stress, is basically to check the level of that hormones, stress hormones in their body. So the higher the higher the level of hormones, stress hormones, that means the more stressed out they are. Okay, now there are also other side effects. So for example, breathing rate increases, blood flow. Now this is another way we can measure. So basically checking blood flow in their body. So if there's a increase in blood flow, that means they are stressed out. Other ways include measuring their blood pressure. This is the easiest, basically blood pressure. So if the blood pressure is high, that means that someone is stressed out. Okay, now, but in the syllabus we're only looking at two. So the first one is brain imaging technique. So using fMRI, if you recall, we studied this in Kangley et al. To do with emotions and memory, I think. Okay, so brain imaging technique, as well as salivary cortisol measure. So cortisol is again a stress hormone. So basically we are measuring the level of cortisol using their saliva. So basically we take their saliva and we measure the level of cortisol in that saliva. Okay, so the first one is brain imaging technique by Wang et al. 2005. Now, fMRI, they use fMRI in Wang et al. So what is fMRI? Is basically a person gets into this machine, which is called the fMRI, and we look at the activity of brain. Okay, so this machine measures brain activity. Okay, now how can we check whether someone is stressed out or relaxed using fMRI? So basically we ask a participant to complete a specific task, so something that can get them to stress out, and then we on another occasion we ask them to do a control task, so where they are more relaxed, and we see the difference between the activity. Okay, so fMRI will detect which part of the brain is activated while doing the task, so while they're stressed out, and compare it with relaxed state. Okay, so these areas in the fMRI which lights up is basically the brain areas that are activated by the stressful task. So this is a basic understanding of how we can measure stress using fMRI. So basically to check the level of activation in the brain. Okay, now in Wang et al., they wanted to investigate the level, the neural experience of stress in the brain. So basically to see the blood flow in the brain when we are stressed out. Okay, so again, what was the side effect of stress is it's the fact that there is an increase in blood flow. So Wang et al. Wanted to see whether there is an increase in blood flow when someone is stressed. Okay, so they use fMRI. Now, there are different methods, there are different ways to use fMRI. Okay, in Wang et al., they use this technique. Again, this is a technique that they use for MRI, which is arterial spin labeling perfusion MRI, to quantify tissue blood flow. So they use this technique to see the blood flow in the brain. Okay, what is arterial spin labeling perfusion MRI? Basically, if you look at your notes, page 255, okay, Um, using this method, basically, um, where is it? Sorry. Okay. Now, below the diagram in your textbook, um, patients are positioned in a large scanner, which is fMRI, that sends a strong magnetic field to their head. The magnetic field causes the nuclei in hydrogen molecules in the brain to spin in a particular way, and this is picked up by the scanner. Because hydrogen concentrations vary in different parts of the brain, it is possible for the scanner to produce a detailed picture of the brain based on the amount of hydrogen molecules it identifies in different areas. So basically, um, this causes it to spin, the hydrogen molecules to spin. So, which means the higher blood flow, that means there should be higher activation in the higher concentration, hydrogen concentration in that part. Okay, so this will tell you which part of the brain is working. Okay, you can, I'm not sure whether you need to know this or not, so if you need to, just in case, just um, have a look through at the ones in your textbook, okay, 255, the one that I just mentioned, just so you know what is arterial spin leveling perfusion. I'm not going to look into it quite deeply, okay. So basically, let's recap back. Wang et al. Wanted to investigate the blood flow in the brain when you're stressed out. Okay, to do this, they use fMRI. Okay, the technique that they use is called arterial spin labeling perfusion to see the spin of hydrogen molecules, the concentration of hydrogen molecules when someone is stressed out. Okay, now, who are the participants in Wang et al? Wang et al. Used 32 participants, which they split into two: stress condition and control condition. So basically, in stress condition, they ask the participants to do a stressful task, where in control, they ask them to do something that makes them relax. Okay, control. Now, what is the reason why they had to is basically to see the difference in brain activities. So the brain activity when they're in relaxed state, and the brain activity when they are in a stressful state, to see which part of the brain is working when someone is stressed out. Okay, what was the procedure? So basically, they go into, okay, so what was the procedure? So basically, they put the participant inside fMRI. So while they are inside, they are being asked to answer questions. So it was a mental arithmetic task. So it's basically maths, which they have to do in their mind, okay, because obviously they can't write it down, so they have to do it in their mind, and they have to say the answers out loud, okay, verbally. Now, to add up the level of stress, the researcher asked for faster response. So basically, they kept prompting them to say, okay, what's answer, okay, so asking them to do it faster. Also, they were asked to restart this test if an error occurred. Okay, so this is the stressful task. Now, once they're done with this task, which is called a high stress condition, they will also do a low stress condition, which is counting 1000 backwards. Okay, so 1999, 998, 997, and so on. Okay, why do they do this? To control for verbal and auditory centers. Let's say, for example, so in this condition, the part of the brain that is supposed to be working is only those responsible for verbal, because they're speaking, and auditory centers, so basically because they are hearing something. Okay, so verbal and auditory centers. So this will tell you them the difference between their brain activity while they are in low stress, while they're only speaking, versus their brain activation when they are doing this task. Okay, to see the difference. Okay, now, what was the data? So basically, at the end of each task, so high stress condition and after low stress condition, they were asked to do a self-report of stress and anxiety level. So on a scale of 1 to 9, as well as saliva samples were taken. Why? To check their level of cortisol. Okay, now when the results were out, it suggested that psychological stress, so when they're doing the stressful task, it induces negative emotion, and the one that was activated highly was the ventral right prefrontal cortex, sorry, which plays a key role in the central stress response. Now, so using this, it suggests that we can measure someone's stress level using fMRI. Okay, using by looking at their blood flow in the brain. Okay, so this is one way, one objective scientific way to measure stress. Now, another physiological measure is salivary cortisol. As I said, we take their saliva and we test for level of cortisol. Why cortisol? Because when you're stressed out, your body tends to release cortisol as well as epinephrine and norepinephrine. This is basically adrenaline. So when you are in the fight or flight mechanism, okay, so cortisol should be released when you're stressed. So that's why, to see whether someone is stressed, we take their saliva and we measure the level of cortisol. Okay, now one study that did this was Evans and Wenner, 2007, which investigated personal space invasion and how this may be one of the key underlying processes that underlie stressful experiences when traveling. So let's say they wanted to know why people are so stressed out when they are traveling. So traveling for work, for us, one of them is commuting. So let's say you live in KB and you work in Bandar. So that's some people find that stressful. But in other countries, most of them use public transportation. So there seems to be high reports of them being stressful. One of when they're traveling. So Evans and Wenner wanted to find out whether was it because of personal space invasion. So let's say when you're in a subway or on your train, there's if you look at the videos in Japan, Tokyo, where they have to cram up in a subway train just to get to work. Okay, so was it because of that? Was it because of personal space invasion? Okay, so in the study, the participants, they used 139 adults commuter, on which 54% of them were male, so quite a balanced number of gender. Okay, 139, 54% of them were males. These people were work of work officers or who commute by a passenger train between New Jersey and into Manhattan. Okay, so they use train daily to get to work. Okay, so participants had been on the same commuting route for an average of 82 months. So these people have been commuting for 82 months on average. Okay, and their average duration of commute to work was 83 minutes. So going from New Jersey to Manhattan to New Jersey, it takes them about 83 minutes per day. Okay, that could be stressful. Now, they measured crowding here in terms of car density and seat density. Now, car density is basically number of passenger, and they calculated by dividing the total number of passenger within the train car. So within that car, one train, okay, one carriage, over the total number of seats. So that's the car density. Seat density is basically where the participant is sitting. So basically, calculated by dividing number of people sitting on the same row by the total number of seats on the row, which is 5. So let's say there were 5 people sitting in that row, and the number of seats was 5, so which means it was completely packed, so it was really dense. Okay, so let's say, for example, one person sitting, and there were 5 seats altogether, so that's less crowded. Okay, so car density, seat density, and they also measured stress. How did they measure stress? By asking them to by doing self-report of stress at the end of the commute, as well as checking their level of cortisol and saliva. So basically, salivary cortisol was collected from each participant through a chewable swab. Okay, you know how they do it for coronavirus now? It's a swab. Okay, and they do it through the nose. For here, they only do it. It's a chewable swab, so which they can remove and give to the researcher, and this researcher can then measure the number of cortisol in that sample. Okay, so they wanted to see the correlation between this, whether if there was a high density in both, or in cardicity or density, does it affect their level of stress. And what they found was, in terms of car density, did not affect level of stress. So how many people in the carriage over number of seats did not affect a level of stress. So if there was high number, that doesn't mean those people are stressed out. But in terms of seating density, okay, if there was a higher seating density, those people tend to have higher level of stress, so higher level of self-report and higher level of cortisol in the saliva. Okay, so this shows how this method, which is salivary cortisol, can be a scientific way as well, to measure stress. Not only that, it is also easier in comparison to brain imaging, in comparison to blood sample, where you have to have people who actually know how to draw blood out of your body, and then you have to do you have to get it to the lab and do all the tests. Okay, so salivary cortisol is easier because you only have to swab them, and then you can do it in the lab and test for cortisol. Okay, so those are the two physiological ways to measure stress, so which is brain imaging using fMRI as well as salivary cortisol. Okay, now let's have a look at psychological measure. How we can measure stress using social readjustment rating scale. So if you remember, this was found by Holmes and Rahe, 1967. Okay, as well as we can do a psychometric test to measure stress level. Let's recap back Holmes and Rahe, which found social readjustment rating scale. Okay, so basically they have ranked 43 life events. Okay, so death of spouse being the highest score, so which means which means high level of stress, highest level of stress actually. Okay, so one way to do it is basically, let's say if you were to measure your stress level, basically you have to, let's say, tick the ones that relates to you. So like, for example, for me is change in responsibilities at work, changing living conditions because of this coronavirus, change in working hours, change in schools, changes of social activity, let's say. So I add up all these numbers, okay, and come back and then total it up. So what is my total? Okay, now from adding it up, you can see if you scored 300 or higher, you are really stressed out, which means you have a high risk of illness, because when you're stressed, you tend to get ill. Remember gas model? Okay, at the end where there's exhaustion, yes, illness. Okay, it's 300 or higher, risk of illness. 150 or 29, moderate risk of illness. 150 or lower, slight risk of illness. So for me, I think mine is lower than 150, so I'm actually not that stressed out at the moment. Okay, so I have a slight risk of illness. So this is one way to measure stress. Okay, one way to quantify it, so by looking at life events. So Rahe et al. 1970 tried to test this, whether this is valid or not, or reliable or not, actually, whether this is reliable. So what Rahe did was, Rahe found 2,500 US military members, so who are sailors. Okay, so he asked them to complete the SSRS. So they come up with a number. So what was the number? And also for 6 months, they notify their visits to the clinic, to the dispensary. So basically whether they tend to get ill or not. So they wanted to see whether there was a correlation, whether if they scored higher, was there a higher visit to the clinics. Okay, so they did this for 6 months, so it's a longitudinal study. And what they found was, there was a positive correlation between reported stress and illness, so as found in the original medical examination of medical records. So from their record, we saw they looked at the illness. Okay, and they look at the number from this figure, the figure from this scale, so SSRS. So if the figure was around 300, there should be higher visit to the dispensary, to the clinics, or higher illness. Okay, so the positive correlation. So which means SSRS, this test is actually reliable. It actually does tell you whether you are likely to get ill or not. So if there's a higher, if you scored higher, that means you have a higher risk of illness. So Rahe et al. Provided evidence for that. Okay, so which makes this test reliable. Okay, now last one. Yes, Friedman and Rosenman, remember, saying that type A personality tends to be more stressful and tends to develop coronary heart disease. So that was in your first subtopic. Okay, so here, easy. So if you want to know someone's level of stress, is basically try to figure out which type of personality there are. So kind of like a personality test. To do that, we use psychometric tests, either interview or questionnaire, to find out whether the type A personality or type B personality. So these are some of the example questions that can be asked in the psychometric test. It's in your notes. Okay, so basically, has your partner or friend ever told you that you eat too fast? Type A's are likely to say yes often, because they are time what is the word, type or basically they want to do everything fast. Okay, so type A. So type B are more relaxed, so they are less likely to be told that they eat fast. Okay, so these are the kind of questions that you can ask in the psychometric test to find out type A personality or type B personality. So from here we can measure the level of stress. If they're type A, there should be a high level of stress. Type B is a lower level of personality, like lower level of stress. Now, again, if you were to compare physiological and psychological measure, obviously the most valid, most objective method is the physiological, but then its practicality, the application is difficult, because you have to get, so there's saliva and you have to go to the lab, or you have to do an fMRI, so it's difficult. Okay, so the easiest and faster way is to use psychological methods. So either a psychometric test, interview, questionnaire, or using self-report, or you can use this. Okay, thank you.